18. Old stood looking down at the boy. The boy sat on the couch leaning sideways against the wall. Oles looked at him silently, his pale eyebrows bristling and stiff and round like the little vegetable brushes the full-of-brush man gives away. He asked the boy, "Do you admit shooting, Brody?" The boy said his favorite 3 words in a muffled voice. Oles sighed and looked at me. I said he doesn't have to admit that. I have his gun. Oles said, "I wish to Christ I had $1 for every time I've had that said to me. What's funny about it?" "It's not meant to be funny," I said. "Well, that's something," Oles said. He turned away. "I've called Wild. We'll go over and see him and take this punk. He can ride with me and you can follow on behind in case he tries to kick me in the face." "How do you like what's in the bedroom?" "I like it fine," Oles said. "I'm kind of glad that Taylor kid went off the pier. I'd hate to have to help send him to the death house for rubbing that skunk." I went back into the small bedroom and blew out the black candles and let them smoke. When I got back to the living room, Oles had the boy up on his feet. The boy stood glaring at him with sharp black eyes and a face as hard and white as cold mutton fat. "Let's go," Oles said, and took him by the arm as if he didn't like touching him. I put the lamps out and followed them out of the house. We got into our cars and I followed Oles' twin taillights and down the long curving hill. I hoped this would be my last trip to Laverne Terrace. Taggart Wild, the district attorney, lived at the corner of 4th and Lafayette Park, in a white frame house the size of a car barn, with a red sandstone porte-cochere built onto one side and a couple of acres of soft rolling lawn in front. It was one of those solid old-fashioned houses which used to be the thing to move bodily to new locations as the city grew westward. Wild came of an old Los Angeles family and had probably been born in the house when it was on West Adams or Figueroa or St. James Park. There were 2 cars in the driveway already, a big private sedan and a police car with a uniformed chauffeur who leaned smoking against his rear fender and admired the moon. Oles went over and spoke to him and the chauffeur looked in at the boy in Oles' car. We went up to the house and rang the bell. A slick-haired blonde man opened the door and led us down the hall and through a huge sunken living room crowded with heavy dark furniture and along another wall on the far side of it. He knocked at the door and stepped inside, then held the door wide and we went into a paneled study with an open French door at the end and a view of dark garden and mysterious trees. A smell of wet earth and flowers came in at the window. There were large dim oils on the walls, easy chairs, books, a smell of good cigar smoke which blended with the smell of wet earth and flowers. Taggart Wild sat behind the desk, a middle-aged plump man with clear blue eyes that managed to have a friendly expression without really having an expression at all. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him, and he held a dappled thin cigar between the neat, careful fingers of his left hand. Another man sat at the corner of the desk in a blue leather chair. A cold-eyed, hatchet-faced man, as lean as a rake and as hard as the manager of a loan office. His neat, well-kept face looked as if it had been shaved within the hour. He wore a well-pressed brown suit and there was a black pearl in his tie. He had the long, nervous fingers of a man with a quick brain. He looked ready for a fight. Oles pulled a chair up and sat down and said, "Evening, Kronjäger. Meet Phil Marlowe, a private eye who's in a jam," Oles grinned. Kronjäger looked at me without nodding. He looked me over as if he was looking at a photograph. Then he nodded his chin about an inch. Wild said, "Sit down, Marlowe. I'll try to handle Captain Kronjäger, but you know how it is. This is a big city now." I sat down and lit a cigarette. Oles looked at Kronjäger and asked, "What did you get on the Randall Place killing?" The hatchet-faced man pulled one of his fingers until the knuckle cracked. He spoke without looking up, a stiff 2 slugs in him. 2 guns that hadn't been fired. Down on the street, we got a blonde trying to start a car that didn't belong to her. Hers was right next to it, the same model. She acted rattled, so the boys brought her in and she spilled. She was in there when this guy Brody got it. Claims she didn't see the killer. That's all? Oles asked. Kohnjäger raised his eyebrows a little. Only happened about an hour ago. What did you expect? Moving pictures of the killing? Maybe a description of the killer, Oles said. A tall guy in leather jerkin, if you call that a description. He's outside my heap, Oles said, handcuffed. Marlowe put the arm on him for you. He's his gun. Oles took the boy's automatic out of his pocket and laid it on a corner of the Wild's desk. Kohnjäger looked at the gun but didn't reach for it. Wild chuckled. He was leaning back and puffing his dappled cigar without letting go of it. He bent forward and sipped from his coffee cup. He took a silk handkerchief from the breast pocket of the dinner jacket he was wearing and touched his lips with it and tucked it away again. There's a couple of more deaths involved, Oles said, pinching the soft flesh at the end of his chin. Kohnjäger stiffened visibly. His surly eyes became points of steely light. Oles said, you heard about a car being lifted out of the Pacific Ocean off Lido Pier this AM with a dead guy in it? Kohnjäger said no and kept on looking nasty. The dead guy in the car was chauffeur to a rich family, Oles said. The family was being blackmailed on account of one of the daughters. Mr. Wild recommended Marlowe to the family through me. Marlowe played it kind of close to the vest. I love private dicks that play murders close to the vest, Kohnjäger snarled. You don't have to be so damned coy about it. Yeah, Oles said. I don't have to be so damn coy about it. It's not so damned often I get a chance to be coy with a city copper. I spent most of my time telling them where to put their feet so they won't break an ankle. Kohnjäger whitened around the corners of his sharp nose. His breath made a soft hissing sound in the quiet room. He said very quietly, you haven't had to tell any of my men where to put their feet, smart guy. Well, we'll see about that, Oles said. This chauffeur I spoke of that's drowned off Lido shot a guy last night in your territory. A guy named Geiger who ran a dirty book racket in a store on Hollywood Boulevard. Geiger was living with a punk I got outside in my car. I mean living with him, if you get the idea. Kohnjäger was staring at him levelly now. That sounds like it might grow up to be a dirty story, he said. It's my experience most police stories are. Oles growled and turned to me, his eyebrows bristling. You're on the air, Marlowe. Give it to him. I gave it to him. I left out two things, not knowing just why at the moment. I left out one of them. I left out Carmen's visit to Brody's apartment, Eddie Marr's visit to Geiger's in the afternoon. I told the rest of it just as it happened. Kohnjäger never took his eyes off my face, and no expression of any kind crossed his as I talked. At the end of it, he was perfectly silent for a long minute. Wild was silent, sipping his coffee, puffing gently at his dappled cigar. Oles stared at one of his thumbs. Kohnjäger leaned slowly back in his chair and crossed one ankle over his knee and rubbed the ankle bone with his thin, nervous hand. His lean face wore a harsh frown. He said with deadly politeness, So all you did was not report a murder that happened last night and then spend today foxing around so that this kid of Geiger's could commit a second murder this evening. That's all, I said. I was in a pretty tough spot. I guess I did wrong, but I wanted to protect my client, and I hadn't any reason to think the boy would go running for Brody. That kind of thinking is police business, Marlowe. If Geiger's dead and had been reported last night, the books could never have been moved from the store to Brody's apartment. The kid wouldn't have been led to Brody and wouldn't have killed him. Say Brody was living on borrowed time. His kind usually are. But life is a life. Right, I said. Tell that to your coppers next time they shoot down some scared petty larceny crook running away up an alley with a stolen spare. Wild put down his hands down on his desk with a solid smack. That's enough of that, he snapped. What makes you so sure, Marlowe, that this Taylor boy shot Geiger? Even if the gun that killed Geiger was found on Taylor's body or in the car, it doesn't absolutely follow that he was the killer. The gun might have been planted, say by Brody, the actual killer. It's physically possible, I said, but morally impossible. It assumes too much coincidence, and too much that's out of character for Brody and his girl, and out of character for what he was trying to do. I talked to Brody for a long time. He was a crook, but not a killer type. He had 2 guns, but he wasn't wearing either of them. He was trying to find a way to cut in on Geiger's racket, which naturally he knew all about from the girl. He says he was watching Geiger off and on to see if he had any tough backers. I believe him. To suppose he killed Geiger in order to get his books, then scrammed with the nude photo Geiger had just taken of Carmen Sternwood, then planted the gun on Owen Taylor and pushed Taylor into the ocean of Lido? It's to suppose a hell of a lot too much. Taylor had the motive, jealous rage, and the opportunity to kill Geiger. He was out in one of the family cars without permission. He killed Geiger right in front of the girl, which Brody would never have done, even if he had been a killer. I can't see anybody with a purely commercial interest in Geiger doing that, but Taylor would have done it. The new photo business was just what would have made him do it. Wild chuckled and looked along his eyes at Kohnjaeger. Kohnjaeger cleared his throat with a snort. Wild asked, "What's the business about hiding the body?" "I don't see the point of that." I said, "The kid hasn't told us, but he must have done it. Brody wouldn't have gone into the house after Geiger was shot. The boy must have got home when I was away taking Carmen to her house. He was afraid of the police, of course, being what he is. And he probably thought it a good idea to have the body hidden until he had removed his effects from the house. He dragged it out of the front door, judging by the marks of the rug, and very likely put it in the garage. Then he packed up whatever belongings he had there and took them away. And later on, sometime in the night and before the body stiffened, he had a revulsion of feeling and thought he hadn't treated his dead friend very nicely. So he went back and laid him out on the bed. That's all guessing, of course." Wild nodded. "Then this morning he goes down to the store as if nothing had happened and keeps his eyes open. And when Brody moved the books out, he found out where they were going and assumed that whoever got them had killed Geiger just for that purpose. He may even have known more about Brody and the girl than they suspected. What do you think, Oles?" Oles said, "We'll find out. But that doesn't help Kohnjaeger's troubles. What's eating him is all this happening last night, and he's only just been rung in on it." Kohnjaeger said sorely, "I think I can find some way to deal with that angle too." He looked at me sharply and immediately looked away again. Wild waved his cigar and said, "Let's see the exhibits, Marlowe." I emptied my pockets and put the catch on the desk. The 3 notes and Geiger's card to General Sternwood, Carmen's photo, and the blue notebook with the code list of names and addresses. I had already given Geiger's keys to Oles. Wild looked at them, looked at what I gave him. Puffing gently at his cigar, Oles lit one of his own toy cigars and blew smoke peacefully at the ceiling. Kohnjaeger leaned on the desk and looked at what I had given Wild. Wild tapped the 3 notes signed by Carmen and said, "I guess these were just a come on. If General Sternwood paid them, it would be through fear of something worse. Then Geiger would have tightened the screws." "Do you know what he was afraid of?" He was looking at me. I shook my head. "Have you told your story complete in all relative details?" "I left out a couple of personal matters. I intend to keep on leaving them out, Mr. Wild." Kohnjaeger said, "Heh," and snorted with deep feeling. "Why?" Wild asked quietly. "Because my client is entitled to that protection, short of anything but a grand jury. I have a license to operate as a private detective. I suppose that word private has some meaning. The Hollywood division has 2 murders on its hands, both solved. They have both killers. They have the motive, the instrument in each case. The blackmail angle has got to be suppressed. As far as the names of the parties are concerned." "Why?" Wild asked again. "That's okay," Kohnjaeger said dryly. "We're glad to stooge for a Seamus of his standing." I said, "I'll show you." I got up and went back out of the house to my car and got the book from Geiger's store out of it. The uniformed police driver was standing beside Ole's car. The boy was inside it, leaning back sideways in a corner. Has he said anything? I asked. He made a suggestion, the copper said and spat. I'm letting it ride. I went back into the house, put the book on Wild's desk, and opened up the wrappings. Kohljaeger was using a telephone on the end of the desk. He hung up and sat down as I came in. Wild looked through the book. Wooden face, closed it and pushed it towards Kohljaeger. Kohljaeger opened it, looked at a page or two, shut it quickly. A couple of red spots, the size of $50, showed on his cheekbones. I said, look at the stamp dates on the front end paper. Kohljaeger opened the book again and looked at them. Well, if necessary, I said, I'll testify under oath that that book came from Geiger's store. The blonde Agnes will admit what kind of business the store did. It's obvious to anybody with eyes that store is just a front for something. But the Hollywood police allowed it to operate for their own reasons. I dare say the grand jury would like to know what those reasons are. Wild grinned. He said, grand juries do ask those embarrassing questions sometimes, in a rather vain effort to find out just why cities are run as they're run. Kohljaeger stood up suddenly and put his hat on. I'm 1 against 3 here, he snapped. I'm a homicide man. If this Geiger was running indecent literature, there's no skin off my nose. But I'm ready to admit it won't help my division any to have it washed over in the papers. What do you birds want? Wild looked at Oles. Oles said calmly, I want to turn a prisoner over to you. Let's go. He stood up. Kohljaeger looked at me fiercely and stalked out of the room. Oles went after him. The door closed again. Wild tapped at his desk and stared at me with his clear blue eyes. You ought to understand how any copper would feel about a cover-up like this, he said. You'll have to make statements of all of it, at least for the files. I think it may be possible to keep the two killings separate and keep General Sternwood's name out of both of them. Do you know why I'm not tearing your ear off? No, I expected to get both ears torn off. What are you getting from it all? $25 a day in expenses. That would make $50 and a little gasoline so far. About that. He put his hand on one side and rubbed the back of his left little finger along the lower edge of his chin. And for that amount of money, you're willing to get yourself in Dutch with half the law enforcement of this country? I don't like it, I said. But what the hell am I to do? I'm on a case. I'm selling what I have to sell to make a living. What little guts and intelligence the Lord gave me and a willingness to get pushed around in order to protect the client. It's against my principles to tell, as much as I've told tonight, without consulting the general. As for the cover-ups, I've been in police business myself, as you know. They come a dime a dozen in any big city. Cops get very large and emphatic when an outsider tries to hide anything. But they do the same things themselves every other day, to oblige their friends or anybody with a little pull. And I'm not through. I'm still on the case. I'd do the same thing again if I had to. Providing Kohljaeger doesn't get your license. Wild grinned. You said you held back a couple of personal matters. Of what import? I'm still on the case, I said, and stared straight into his eyes. Wild smiled at me. He had the frank, daring smile of an Irishman. Let me tell you something, son. My father was a close friend of old Sternwood. I've done all my office permits, and maybe a good deal more to save the old man from grief. But in the long run, it can't be done. Those girls of his are bound certain to hook up with something that can't be hushed, especially that little blonde brat. They ought not to be running around loose. I blame the old man for that. I guess he doesn't realize what the world is today. And there's another thing I might mention while we're talking man to man and I don't have to growl at you. I'll bet $1 to a Canadian dime that the general's afraid of his son-in-law, the ex-bootlegger, is mixed up in this somewhere. And what he really hoped you would find out is that he isn't. What do you think of that? Reagan didn't sound like a blackmailer, what I heard of him. He had a soft spot where he was, and he walked out on it. Wild snorted, "The softness of that spot, neither you nor I could judge. If he was a certain sort of man, it would have not been so very soft. Did the general tell you he was looking for Reagan? He told me he wished he knew where he was and that he was all right. He liked Reagan, and it was hurt the way he bounced off without telling the old man goodbye." Wild leaned back and frowned. "I see," he said in a changed voice. His hand moved the stuff on his desk around, laid Geiger's blue notebook to one side, and pushed the other exhibits towards me. "You may as well take these," he said. "I have no further use for them."